Okay, hello. I hope you are having a good day. Thank you for clicking this lecture video. And this lecture video is primarily dedicated to my purposive communication students. But this is also a good lecture video for those who are about to start their purposive communication classes because this includes the definition of purposive communication and also a brief overview of the definition of communication itself and the communication process in the elements of communication. So I hope that you will learn something from this very short lecture video. So purposive communication is the one of the general education subjects in tertiary education. So for full definition, it is a fundamental course in general education curriculum for tertiary education. This is called as fundamental because no matter what course you will enroll in college or no matter what course you are in college, you really have to undergo this subject. And this is crafted to train you to become an effective listener, competent speaker, and of course, a skilled writer. These three macro skills are very vital, especially if you are already in the field of work. And this will also expose you to the communication process, ethics, and principles in communication and globalization and global communication in multicultural setting, aided of course with technology, just like what we are doing now in our virtual classes, and then bringing the life of the locals into a global village. We have to widen our horizon. We have to think globally in our own locality in order for us to become globally competitive, especially if we are hunting jobs after you, especially if you are hunting jobs after your graduation. So you will also be taught in the subject how to prepare memorandums, business letters, reports, and academic paper. So academic paper is a shortened thesis or dissertation. So it can be in a form of IMRAD or introduction, methodology, results, and discussion. So you will learn a lot from this subject and I hope you will be interested. So before exposing you to different forms of communication, both oral and written communication, let's have a quick preview of what communication is. Communication, what is communication? So communication is sometimes defined as the process of sending and receiving a message. So from this definition, there should be a sender and there should also be a receiver and a message. So once there will be an exchange of message, that's already a conversation. But I also want you to take note that even if you are sending a message to yourself, that is still a communication. That's why there is the so-called intrapersonal communication, because there are times that you also need to talk to yourself, that you also need to give some pieces of of advice to yourself, especially if no one else will do it for you, or like you need some encouragement and there is no other person to do it for you, then you better do it for yourself. And still, that is communication, and we will call it as intrapersonal communication. Okay, so another definition is that it is the process of using verbal and nonverbal messages to generate meaning within and across various contexts, cultures, and channels. That is according to Engelbert and Wynne 2008. So it is considered here that the meaning is generated in accordance to the context, the cultures, and the channels. That's why it's very important that as you communicate, you need to consider the culture of the person you are communicating with, so that you will be able to identify whether that person has this has a shared understanding with you, because there are cases that some words may differ in other dialects or in other languages. So we will go into the deeper explanation of these things, the context, the cultures, and the channels as we go along this lecture video. Okay, so now I am showing you an illustration of the elements of communication. If you'll see, we have here the source and the receiver. So in turn, as the conversation continues, the receiver will also become the source, as he or she will give the feedback. So we have here the feedback. So let's name this two as John and Anna. So, for example, John will say, I love you, and Anna also replied, I love you too. So, the message there is, I love you, and the feedback is, I love you too. So, upon the delivery of the message, there could be an interference, or what we call as barrier or noise. So for example, if they are having their conversation at the side of the street and there are a lot of vehicles passing by, so we can expect that there is really an external noise trying to interfere the conversation. So the tendency would be the message will not be perceived as intended by the sender. So the meaning of the message will not be perceived appropriately by the receiver. So once once the receiver will initiate another topic, she will become, or shall we say Anna, will also become the sender. So once the message is being sent by the sender, the receiver will try to decode the message in order to have a comprehension. So in the actual conversation, you cannot single out the flow of the communication, because as human as we are, that is as quick as the lightning travels. So it is already programmed in our brain that once we hear this, this will be our feedback and that will be our interpretation. And of course, the interpretation or the decoding of the meaning will again depend on the orientation of the receiver. So for example, if they are a couple and then John would say to Anna, I love you, then Anna might be glad hearing the message, but if they are not couple, they are just strangers, and Anna would hear that message, probably Anna would be alarmed. Why? Is this man telling me that he loves me? So, like that. So, the language orientation, the social context must be considered in a conversation. So, that's why uh, in the illustration, you can see that the conversation is surrounded by the circle labeled as context, because the entire interpretation of the meaning of the message will really depend according to the context. And aside from the context, there is a frame of reference quite similar to context, and that is the field of experience of both the communicators. So for example, if John is an engineer and Anna is a doctor, then John should not use the technical terms or the jargons of engineers in communicating with Anna, because Anna might not be able to understand what he is trying to convey. So it is better to use a simple yet understandable language. Okay, so with this simple illustration, you might be able to understand what are the elements of communication and how communication flows and how communication process is being labeled here. But let's try to single out everything for a deeper understanding. So we have here first the sender and the receiver. Of course, the sender is the one who initiates the communication, is or the one who try to speak first. So, and also he I'm referring to John in the illustration. He establishes also the purpose of the message. And there are three common purposes in sending a message. And that could be to inform, to persuade, or to call for an action. Okay, so on the other hand, the receiver is the one for whom the message is intended and sent. So to whom the message is being sent. So if you heard the message, then automatically you are the receiver of the message. So even if John is just shouting there at the street and you hear that word that John just shouted, then you can be considered as the receiver in that communication process. So, so the message, it is the meat of the communication process. It contains information, the thought, the feelings that a communicator expresses to other participant in the communication process. I have included here the feelings, the thought that the communicator expresses, because even if you don't verbally respond to the message being sent, like if John would say I love you and Anna is just silent and does not give any answer to that, that silence will also mean a thing. Will also mean a thing. That silence could also could mean that she is not interested with the message or the feeling being conveyed by John, or she is just surprised with the message being sent. So even silence has an intended meaning. So even if you don't hear a verbal response to the message you send, still communication happens. So the sender determines the purpose of the message, and this can be one of these three forms. So uh, this is what I have told you earlier. to inform, to persuade, or to take an action. To inform is very common in written communications, like in memos, in journals, in business letters, like you are informed that tomorrow we will have our meeting. So to persuade, this is very common in commercial advertisements, where you are convinced to buy a certain product. And then, or to take an action, this is also common in memorandums, like your director is commanding you to observe social measures during the pandemic. So these are the intentions of the message. So the third element of communication is channel or medium. In this, it identifies how the message is delivered in a verbal and face-to-face communication. The air serves as the medium, and messages are transmitted through sound and light waves. That's why my presentation here, I really use like wavelengths in order for you to remind you, or to make it easier for you to retain in your mind that the medium of communication is the light wave and the sound wave that goes through while you are communicating. Why there is light wave? What? Why? Because while you are communicating, you need to see the the counterpart verbal, non-verbal expressions of the communicator. So for example, if John would say the message is I love you. So the counterpart non-verbal cue of John may not be in accordance to the message. For example, when he said that message, the expression or the eye expression of John may not be that sincere. So the tendency is that Anna will not be convinced with the message being sent by John. So that's why I included here light waves. So this is the perks of having a face-to-face interaction or face-to-face communication, because you can see the verbal cue, the non-verbal cues, because the non-verbal cues will really help you in decoding the intended message of the sender. So unlike in text messages, you really cannot measure the the sincerity of the one sending the message, because there is the absence of the nonverbal cues. But in written communications like memorandums, business letters, and academic papers, of course, you cannot expect for nonverbal cues. So that's why it is a privilege for you if the conversation happened in a face-to-face communication. So the air serves as the medium or the channel. So a channel can also be sensory, such as how somebody holds or shake hands with you. It can also be other means, like the use of technology or any other medium like telephone, email, voicemail, video recording, and written memorandum. So this time, electronic mail is more common compared to the the traditional mail, where it will take few months before it arrives. So now we have the email, the video call, then the written memorandum, and even the written memorandum is already sent via the via Gmail. So those are mediums of communication. So let me go back to the sensory, like how somebody holds or shake hands with you. So if someone shook his hand with you in a shivering way, that may imply that that person is quite nervous upon meeting you. So that would still imply something. Okay, next is the feedback. Of course, this is to respond to the message. It refers to the receiver's response to the sent messages. This make communication two-way process. So it indicates how the message is interpreted. So when I say two-way process, meaning there is a verbal response to the message being sent by the sender, because there is also a one-way communication process where you are just talking to yourself. Okay, so when you are just talking to yourself, that is a one-way communication process. So the feedback will indicate how the message is interpreted. So that's why the response is very important. Even in the Google Classroom, for example, the teacher will really require you to comment on the comment section so that the teacher would know that you have deciphered or you have understood the instructions of of the teacher. So if you don't comment something, meaning the tendency is that you just ignore the instructions or you don't understand the instructions given by your teacher. So if there is a comment in the comment section, meaning you have received the message, you have understood the message, you are thankful to receive the message. So it indicates how the message is interpreted. So if you comment a question on the posted instructions, meaning you are having some confusions with the posted instructions. So that's how important a feedback is. So how it is seen, heard, understood, it conveys the receiver's emotions or feelings about the message and towards its sender. So in my example a while ago about John and Anna, so if Anna would say I love you too, it means that Anna is also interested with John. So as simple as that. Next is the context. If you remember in our illustration, this is trying to surround the entire communication process because the decoding of the meaning of the intended message depends on the context. So what is context? It affects the way communicators send and receive messages. It refers to the circumstances, the situation, the condition, environment where communication occurs. That's why there are different types of contexts. You have the social context, the psychological context, the psychosocial context, the environmental or the physical context. When you say social context, it refers to the relationships that exist between the communicators. So, for example, you are communicating with a teacher, then there is an expectation that you will be a little bit courteous compared to when you are communicating with your mother or you're communicating with your peers. So you have to know your relationships. You have to base your manners of communicating based on your relationships because that will really vary. You don't also have to communicate with your fiance, for example, or your lover with the way you communicate by your teacher. That's also quite boring. You also have to be more romantic. You also have to be more intimate. So, and also the temperature, the lighting, furniture, it also communicates something. So for example, if the context or the environmental context is too hot, and then the communicators will be less comfortable, and the meaning of the message will also vary according to the temperature. So like that. So your interpretation of the message will vary according to the context. So another for environmental or for situations like if the teacher will ask you to get a mouse and you are in a computer class, of course you will give your or you will raise your mouse, which is part of your computer or hardware part of your computer. But if you are in a biology class and you are asked to point the picture of the mouse, then of course you are expected to point the picture of the scavenger mouse. So that's how contexts vary in a communication process. So next, we have the interference or the noise or the barrier. This is an element of communication because sometimes it affects the decoding of the intended meaning of the message. So the tendency is that the receiver would not be able to perceive the appropriate meaning because of the noise or the barrier. Okay, it is defined as an impediment to successful communication, and it is anything that hinders shared understanding. Generally, noise is classified into external, internal, and semantic. So, what are the types of noise, or what are the general types of barriers? So, let's have first. Okay, the external noise. So external noise, it originates from the communicator's surroundings or environment. Like there is someone there grilling outside in the construction area, or just your murmuring mother or your crying toddler at home, or what the passing but the buses passing by if you are living near the highway, or the video key sessions in the neighborhood, like that. That's why during this pandemic, video key are, I guess, banned in Cebu City in order not to distract those who are having online classes or online jobs. So this is quite explanatory. When you say external, that's something you can hear around. But when you see internal, that's something you can feel inside you, like your attitudes, your opinions, your beliefs, and also psychological thoughts like worry, fear, anxiety, disappointment, and prejudice. So, for example, if you are talking, like in my case, I am discussing to my students, and my students are all hungry, the tendency is that my students will not be able to totally comprehend what I am trying to discuss because they are all hungry and they need some snacks. So that's an example of internal noise. Or I am talking to somebody who is not in good mood. So still that's an interference in the communication process. Another thing is also is the difference in beliefs or opinions. For example, you are talking about the beliefs, your beliefs in your religion to someone of a different religion, then the tendency is that you will not agree with what you are or the receiver will may not agree to the opinion that you are trying to impose to him or her because you have different beliefs. The bottom line is you just have to respect the the differences of your beliefs and opinions because there is no other way, because we will really be different in terms of this. We have our individual differences, and unity in terms of opinions and beliefs is really impossible. So we also have, excuse me, we also have semantic noise. It gets in the way when the sender and the receiver do not share the same meanings for their verbal and nonverbal signals. Examples, jargons. So for example, a certain language is having a different meaning in another language. This is very common in dialects where the meaning is not the same. For example, the sili in Cebuano Visayan is having a different meaning somewhere in in summer, I guess, in summer. So there are a lot of terms in Cebuano Visayan also that have different morphological associations in somewhere in Luzon. For example, langgam is an ant in Luzon, but it's a bird in Cebuano Visayan. Opa in Cebuano Visayan could something be very obscene, but in Luzon it's a rent. So like that. So if you are talking to someone with different uh, repository of meanings, then you also have to consider that in order to avoid misunderstanding in your conversation. So these are the three common or general classifications of noise or interference. This is called interference because literally this will interfere the communication process. So the tendency, if these noises will prevail in the communication, the meaning will not be delivered as intended. Okay, next, last, this is the frame of reference. So this is quite part of the context. Yeah, this quite part of the context because it only refers to the field of experience of someone, because the choice of words will depend on the field of experience of the communicators. So these are called language registers. So if a group of doctors are talking, of course they will be using technical terms about medicine, and as well as with the lawyers they will be talking about uh, language of laws. So this is quite similar to the context, to the psychological context. So you have to consider. So if you are of a higher field of expertise and you are talking to someone who cannot understand your technical terms, you have to stoop down in order for you to have an effective communication process. Just use simple yet understandable language, because the main intention of communication is to understand and to be understood. Okay, thank you. If you have some questions, just comment.